Okay, this is part 3 of why what Mitch McConnell says, we don't tax too little, that is false. Why that is false. Now I was talking about the Bush tax cuts here, and this was the Tax Act of 2001, and he lowered the estate tax here and increased the exemption. But one other thing that he did here was that he repealed the estate tax for 1 year back here in 2010. Okay? Now there was one other big Bush tax cut, $350 billion. It was called the Jobs and Growth Tax Relief Reconciliation Act of 2003. Here, Republicans control both houses. And what they did here, what he did, is the 4 top rates, income tax rates, the 39.6 was reduced to 35, the 36 to 33, the 31 to 28, and the 28 to 25. And that was done in stages here to be completed by 2006. But this tax act right here, we made them all effective here in 2003. Now you can see right here, the top rate now is 35%. Okay. One more thing this bill did was reduce here the capital gains tax long term from 20 to 15. And it gave preferential treatment to dividends. Now they were taxed also at 15%. And that tax cut was for 6 years here. Now you may have heard of the 2 big Bush tax cuts, but you probably haven't heard of the third. The Tax Increase Prevention and Reconciliation Act of 2005. And what that did is extend the lower taxation here on capital gains and dividends at 15% for 2 more years. That would be through 2009 and 2010. Now why would they do that 3 years here ahead of time? Well, that's because the Republicans here controlled both houses. And they thought if they didn't do it now, if the Democrats got control, they would not be able to extend those 2 taxes. Now these 2 tax cuts here, 2/3 goes to the top 1%. 70% of the income of the 400 richest families are capital gains and dividends. That's why Warren Buffett here, he pays 15% on his income, and the secretary pays 33%. Now look at all of these Bush tax cuts here are irresponsible. Why? Because we're in 2 wars. The Afghanistan war here began in 2001 and is still going on. Not scheduled to end until 2015. The cost of that war to date is $513 billion. And the Iraq war here began in 2003. It didn't end until 2011. The cost of that war is $802 billion. Now, Bush is the only president in U.S. history to cut taxes during war. Not only 1 war, but 2 wars going on simultaneously. If you go back here to the Vietnam War, they raised, there was a surcharge on income here of 10%. Likewise on the corporate income tax profits. There's also a raise here in the long-term capital gains tax. If you go back here to the Korean War, you can see here the income tax was increased here from 84 to 92. Corporate tax from 38 to 52. And if you go back, FDR raised taxes during World War II. Woodrow Wilson raised taxes during World War I. Lincoln raised taxes during the Civil War. But George Bush lowers taxes during 2 wars. 50% of these taxes go to the top 1%. While these men up here are dying and getting their limbs blown off, George Bush gives to himself and his cabinet and executives a tax cut. Okay. During this 8 years that Bush was in office here, the national debt here increased 90%, 0.1. And look here. Clinton here turned the national debt down, now it's shooting up again. The debt to GDP, the percentage, increases here from 57 all the way up here to 69.4. Now, during this 8-year period here, the national debt increases $4 trillion in 8 years. I'm going to read you something here from the Senator Bernie Sanders. He's an independent. He's been in Congress since 1988. And he said these deficits right here are caused by 2 wars. Here they are, the Afghanistan and Iraq, by huge tax breaks for wealthy Americans. Here they are, the estate tax, the income tax, capital gains, and dividend tax. And he said the third reason, by the recession, was caused by Wall Street greed, recklessness, and illegal behavior on Wall Street. Now what he is referring to there is the securitization and marketing of mortgage-backed securities. Originally, when banks made loans to home buyers, they would verify credit applications to minimize risk because they held the mortgage. And home buyers made payments to banks. But that all changed with deregulation. Now it was possible, the deregulation allowed banks and mortgage lenders to sell their mortgages to investment banks. The investment banks put them into bundles called mortgage-backed securities, rated them AAA, when in fact they were CCC, likely to default, and sold them on the bond market. Now the reason there was a deterioration here in lending standards, I mean, homes right here were sold with little or no down, and there was no verification of credit. They were called liar loans. Why? Because the mortgage lenders would transfer the risk to the investment banks and the investment bank to investors. Okay, housing prices here doubled and tripled. And you know, as a bubble increases, eventually it breaks. Well, that's what happened to the housing bubble here. In 2007, it broke, and home prices plummeted, and there was a rapid increase in delinquencies and foreclosures, and these mortgage-backed securities lost their value. Now, there's a second part to this. These bonds were insured by a credit default swap. Meaning, if there was a default, you could take your bonds and return it to the insurer and he would refund your money. But there was such a deluge or avalanche of defaults, these investment firms on Wall Street did not have enough money in reserve to make good the swap. And there was $1.3 trillion of subprime mortgages outstanding here. And there was a fear that the entire credit market here would collapse. And Congress stepped in with a $700 billion bailout of Wall Street. That was called TARP, Troubled Asset Relief Program. Okay? Now listen. Mitch McConnell says, we have a spending problem here. We don't tax too little, but that's false. Domestic programs are not the cause of this $4 million deficit here. He's responsible as a lawmaker, and I'll tell you why. He voted to give Bush authority to use military force here in Iraq and Afghanistan. Mitch McConnell voted for all the Bush tax cuts, and he signed the Norquist no tax increase pledge, meaning he refuses to pay for these two wars. Now look at the cost of these two wars and the cost of these two Bush tax cuts right here is $3 million. I mean, $3 trillion. Now the rest of that is interest, not domestic programs. Okay. Now, what is the consequence? Okay, just before we get there, I'm going to go back here and say this. The repeal of the estate tax here in 2010, you know what Bush says? The estate tax doesn't make any sense. It makes a lot of sense. I'll tell you why. All this debt that's built up here from Reagan if you don't have a estate tax, you transfer that to the next generation, and the people who built it up here, well, anybody that lived during this period right here, when he dies here, he leaves all these unpaid taxes. So it's correct and fair to tax his estate, the state to collect some of these back taxes before you transfer it to the next generation. If you don't have the estate tax, you transfer all this debt that these people created here to the next generation of the newborn who did not create it. And I want to tell you something else. Mitch McConnell, he voted to repeal the estate tax permanently. Why? Because he represents the top 2% multimillionaires like himself, not the 98% of people. Now look at, what is the consequence of all this debt right here? Interest on the national debt. Now the U.S. Department, the U.S. Treasury Department does not keep record here beyond 1988. So I'll go back here to the last year that Reagan was in office. The cost of the interest on the national debt just for that 1 year was $214 billion. For 4 years Bush was in office, $1 trillion, $83 billion. The cost of, okay, that is the end of, I got a message. That's the end of part 3. I'll continue in the next segment. Thank you.